morning, everyone. I'm Rebecca Vickers, and on behalf of the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association, welcome to today's webinar entitled Adolescent Recovery-Oriented Systems of Care with Emily Hennessy. This webinar is being made available through a collaboration of the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health, and the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. Please note that as an attendee, you are in listen-only mode and will only be able to view your name. If you have questions, please send them to the presenter and me, the host, by using the chat panel. The button to open the panel is usually located in the lower right side of your monitor. Please use the chat panel to send any questions you may have as you think of them. The presenter will address questions as time permits. Our audio is broadcast through the internet to your computer. If you experience poor computer audio, there are a few options to try on screen right now, and these options will be posted in the chat panel. If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and use the I will call in telephone option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance and statement of credit. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on FADAA's website within 30 business days. To access the recording and PowerPoints, go to www.fadaa.org, then to our Resource Center, and then to our training library. FADAA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on FADAA's website. You will first need to register or sign into your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FADAA as a part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 30 business days after the evaluation closes. For persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Please note the evaluation will close midnight Wednesday, March 2nd. Up to 2 continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through the Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, be sure to include your Florida license numbers when you register with our site for reporting to CE Broker. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you do not need to provide your certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrivals and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide a certificate of attendance if you do not attend the entire webinar, and we are not permitted to provide partial CE credit. Emily Hennessy, PhD, is an Associate Director of Biostatistics at the Recovery Research Institute and a member of the faculty at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Hennessy completed her PhD in Community Research and Action at Vanderbilt University and a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Connecticut in the Sharp Lab. And now I'd like to welcome our wonderful presenter, Emily Hennessy. I will turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks, Rebecca, for the warm welcome, and for everybody who's listening in. Thank you for having me. I'm just really delighted to be here talking with you today about adolescent recovery-oriented systems of care. Okay, so before I dive into the presentation, I do want to just acknowledge my collaborators and colleagues. They have really just done wonderful work in thinking through these issues with me and really have provided a lot of the groundwork for what I'm going to be talking about today. And I do need to acknowledge that some of the work that's presented here is supported by funding from the National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism. So there's 3 primary objectives that I want to focus on today. The first is really just providing a strong foundation for why an adolescent recovery-oriented system of care, or AROPS for short, is really important. And that'll be demonstrated by a review of the adolescent recovery process, as well as what recovery capital looks like for adolescents, or how we conceptualize it for adolescents. The second primary objective is really to kind of describe a ROSC in general and what an adolescent recovery-oriented systems of care approach should look like, as well as to discuss some strategies that can help build youth recovery capital through this ROSC approach. So this is just kind of the general overview of how the talk is broken down. There'll be time for questions. I'll take a pause between each of the sections. But of course, if you have questions in between those times, please put them in the chat. I'm happy to be interrupted to talk through any of what I'm presenting or kind of larger questions about AROSC in general. So definitely feel free to interact as you think would be important to understanding the topic. So to begin with, I just kind of want to lay the foundation before I jump into adolescent development and substance use, and really around the basis of what a ROSC is. And Dr. Iyojama Akara has kind of provided us with this kind of foundational perspective on what a ROSC can achieve. And so essentially a ROSC is a value-based framework that guides us in thinking about how to develop a network of formal and informal services and supports. And so it's really important as we're talking about a ROSC to not think about it as a packaged approach or something that has X, Y, and Z components, but really as something that is this transformational way of thinking about a system and looking at a system and working on a system to improve ultimately outcomes for adolescents and their families. And so this is kind of the basic underpinning of why this kind of work is important and why we're here today. So to begin, we need to talk about adolescent development and substance use, especially substance use that gets into the problematic area where there is a disorder that kind of comes with it, or addiction, as some people would talk about, drug use or alcohol use. And so if we go back to some statistics from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health with adolescents and young adults, what we can see here is a map of illicit drug use disorder in the United States for the year 2018 and 2019. And so illicit drug use disorders as measured by this survey were marijuana, cocaine, crack, heroin, hallucinogens, inhalants, meth, and prescription psychotherapeutics that could have been misused, like pain relievers and sedatives. So those are kind of all the different kinds of drugs that could make up an illicit drug use disorder. And what we see is that about 2.5% to nearly 5% of the total treatment population experienced a illicit drug use disorder. That is, youth and young adults made up about that percentage point. We can see that Florida is kind of right in the middle there, around 3% of its treatment population were youth and young adults. So that's kind of important context, because 3% doesn't sound like a whole lot, but it ends up being, over 100,000 youth. So it can be quite a large number. And we see similar, although smaller numbers for alcohol use disorder. This is the same survey from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health for 2018 and 2019, youth and young adults. And here we see across the United States that between 1.25% and just over 2.5% of youth, of the treatment population were youth and young adults. And so again, a fairly large representation in this national sample, although we see that in terms of numbers, Florida seems to be on the lower end of having youth that report an alcohol use disorder. And so what do we know about the teenage years, right? It's been termed kind of this time of storm and stress by some folks. And that's because teenagers, adolescents in particular, are going through a variety of biological, physical, and neurological development and changes. During this time, they're also figuring out who they are in this world, which is kind of this idea of their ego and their identity development. And they're building self-regulation skills, but they're identifying as a result kind of these new social needs and skills, and their networks are changing, their social networks, who they are seeking out and who they're hanging out with outside of the family. And all these things are happening in this context of great change that they're trying to come to terms with. And so one key aspect during this time are these social and identity changes, because this is a time when adolescents are looking outside the family, their family unit kind of for support, for approval. If you think about kind of the later adolescent stage, these are nearly emerging adults, so they're moving out or away from a family that is oftentimes they have to kind of look for housing or look for a way to support themselves. And during this time, we see that they're relying a lot more on peer social networks for both support and approval. And so how they perceive others' use of substances or others' views of substance use becomes really important during this time. And unfortunately, what we know about social peer networks at this age is that they often tend to reward more risky decisions. So for adolescents who are in the midst of developing their identity, which is kind of driven from who they are in the context of who they're hanging out with, if they're rewarded for engaging in more risky behaviors, they may feel like those are better decisions to make than some other kind of non-risky behavior. So peer networks can definitely reward more risky decisions, which can also lead to greater alcohol and drug use. And what we also know during this time is that as a result of kind of these peer networks, and then also just where they are in their development, there is this heightened vulnerability to trying out different substances, so kind of experimenting with different substances. But as a result of this experimentation, given their age and their developmental status, there's a resulting heightened vulnerability to taking up substance use more habitually, and so developing more of a habit versus just sticking to the experimentation side of things. And so what we also know as a result of this stage of development is that there's a high likelihood of kind of more impulsive behaviors, risk-taking, and then that kind of reward seeking that I alluded to earlier. And so because that's something that they're thinking more about and doing more, then it could result in greater substance use. And unfortunately, what we know about adolescent substance use in particular is that biologically they're highly sensitive to the use of any sort of psychoactive substance. And the effects on the developing brain can be very toxic, and this is going to vary by different substances. There's been a great amount of research that looks at brain imaging scans and really tries to nail down what are the effects of substances on the developing brain. And so this slide here, this picture example is from some of Susan Tapert's work. And she was looking at the cognitive function of teenagers who were heavy drinkers versus non-heavy drinkers. And so obviously there's kind of a wide variety in what brain scans can look like, but what we see here is on the left what the type of cognitive kind of response to a cognitive task that you would expect in a normal developing 15-year-old. And on the right, it's a similar cognitive task, but the brain response is quite a bit lower. And the only difference, one of the primary differences between these two scans is the level of alcohol use. So specifically, the person on the right was engaged in heavy drinking and the person on the left was not. That's just one example, but there's a variety of research that has documented this across different substances. And so I alluded to this concept of, adolescence is this developmental stage of storm and stress, and there's a wide variety across this stage. But it's also important to remember that it's not just this one, every adolescent looks the same, right? So if we think about it from the stages of adolescent development in terms of physical, cognitive, and emotional health, there's actually quite a bit of variation across the ages of 10 to 21 in terms of what adolescents should be capable of and kind of how their bodies are functioning. And so it's really important to remember that when thinking about the treatment and recovery process as a whole. And so if we begin with kind of this early adolescent stage, ages 10 to 13 of youth, in terms of physical changes, this is where kind of puberty is going to be beginning, the growth spurts. So there's going to be these new physical changes that they're going to be reckoning with and trying to get a hold of. And at the same time, this is where their cognitions are starting to change. So they're starting to be able to think abstractly and kind of think about things that aren't tangible, but they're also going to have a very present focus. And so what's happening in the moment, what's happening with their friends around them is going to be highly important to how they're going to behave. And so that's important to remember kind of as we move through these stages. In terms of emotional development, this is where, as I mentioned earlier, they're starting to think about their identity as who they are as individuals that may be in conflict with how their family sees them or how their family wants to see them. The peers that are around them are going to be really important to how they consider their identity development. And so that can also cause some additional conflict with parents as they kind of try to figure out how to navigate these changes. And so that's kind of the early adolescent phase. Moving into middle adolescence, it's ages 14 to 18. This is oftentimes where you would see the experimentation with substance use kind of traditionally begin. Although in more severe substance use disorder cases, you will see the earlier ages kind of start to use substances before this time period. But in middle development, we see in terms of physical development, puberty is kind of being completed or complete by the end of this phase. Girls' growth, physical growth is definitely slowing. In terms of cognitive development, they have a greater ability to engage in more abstract thinking. So although that was being developed earlier, now they're actually able to kind of use that more frequently. And this is a time when, although they're still highly focused on the present, they are still able to begin to set goals if those goals are kind of scaffolded appropriately. And then in terms of emotional development, this is really where you see that emotional development that kind of started in 10 to 13 years old, where they're starting to break away. Now they're really on this pathway of independence or starting maybe a romantic relationship. And those peers that were heavily influencing them are now their close friends. And the friends are really going to be this central influence in their behaviors and how they think about and perceive the world. And so finally, kind of after this stage, moving into the later adolescent stage, so ages 19 to 21, this is where in terms of physical health, we start to see that girls become more fully developed, although boys can kind of continue growing beyond that. They tend to lag behind girls in terms of that physical growth. In terms of cognitive development, this is where we start to see greater thought processing ability and the ability to kind of delay gratification in terms of being able to think about future, right? So in an immediate choice situation where they have to make a decision, they can begin to start to think about how this choice may impact things that they want to have happen down the road. And during this time, in terms of emotional development, this is where we say that they're starting to develop more of a firm identity in who they are and who they are in the social world. And typically then their emotional stability, their emotions have kind of stabilized. Although oftentimes if there's kind of a more severe mental illness, this might be where that kind of presents itself. And I see there's a question in the chat about numbers of adolescents that might have been diagnosed with a drug-induced psychosis. I know that there are numbers that have looked at this. I think it varies across research studies, so I don't have an exact statistic to provide for you, but that's a really important thing to note, is that for adolescents that are using substances and are using them heavily, there can be all these kind of consequential side effects that end up being very serious, including a drug-induced psychosis. And so that also brings me to another point, and which I alluded to a little bit earlier, but essentially, these stages of adolescent development are mapped out pretty nicely by the Centers for Disease Control. But what happens when an adolescent starts using in early adolescence or middle adolescence, it ends up kind of pushing some of these developmental pieces later, right? Sometimes it can actually kind of stop some of that cognitive development or really slow it down, some of that emotional development. They're replacing the use of substances with coping skills, for example. And so when thinking about working with adolescents and even kind of that early and emerging adult period, it's really important to understand when they started using substances, because that's really going to affect how they progress through this trajectory and how they progress through their treatment and recovery experience. So moving on to think about adolescent recovery. And so this is really kind of situated with the idea, I don't remember who basically it means that the treatment episode that someone's engaged in can be really helpful, right, in the moment. And it can provide folks with a variety of skills to address their substance use, stop their substance use. And then what happens, right? They go back to their homes, they go back to their peer networks. Um, and for adolescents, especially who maybe have not developed the type of cognitive reasoning or abstract thinking, future orientation, they're still kind of developing that. When they go back to that home environment, they may not be able to see through those potential consequences as clearly as maybe an adult will. And they're being surrounded by some of the folks that maybe were encouraging their substance use in the first place. And so it's really important, I think, to situate adolescent recovery within kind of the larger discussion of what different folks have talked about in terms of like what is recovery, right? There's many definitions. I think that the definitions that are the most holistic tend to be the ones that are most useful for thinking about adolescent recovery. So those are the ones that I've chosen to highlight here today. So the first one is from the Betty Ford Institute Consensus Panel from 2007, and it says that essentially recovery is a voluntarily maintained lifestyle characterized by sobriety, personal health, and citizenship. And similarly, SAMHSA has defined recovery as a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, and strive to reach their full potential. And so what we see in both of these definitions of recovery is really the sense that recovery is not just stopping substance use, even though we're talking about stopping substance use through treatment and continuing care supports. It's really about helping someone kind of live their full life, achieve full citizenship in their communities, with their families, and really kind of take control over their experience and their life. And so that's just kind of important framing for thinking about what we're going to be talking about next. And so really it's important to remember when we're talking about recovery, although a lot of the work kind of initiated from thinking about adult recovery, sorry, it's important to remember that adolescent recovery is not the same as adult recovery. And so it requires kind of a different lens to think about the process. So adolescents will tend to use kind of multiple substances and a broader array of substances at the time. And so sometimes it can make diagnosing them with a particular substance use disorder kind of difficult if they're using all these substances to deal with their interactions in the world. Something that we know that's come out of first animal studies and then some human studies is that adolescents can actually drink more alcohol than adults without maybe feeling some of the consequences, but ultimately this can result in more severe substance use patterns. And so it's something to be on the lookout for. Sorry, suffering from a bit of a cold. Adolescents may also experience serious problems as a result of their substance use in, a variety of domains. Can get in the way of their development and they're engaging in different activities, but they still might not meet diagnostic criteria, which can make getting them into treatment or convincing them that they need treatment very difficult. As well, we also know that adolescents are much more likely to return to using a substance due to the social influences that are around them, due to their peers, due to their friends. And it's much more likely than adults, actually. And what we also know is that access to treatment is obviously necessary oftentimes for starting that recovery journey, but it's not enough in most cases. And so for adolescents especially, this kind of initial acute clinical intervention stage, while it's very effective in the moment, what ends up happening when youth return kind of back to their pre-treatment environment is a high rate of relapse. And so studies have shown that within 6 to 12 months, around 60% of youth can relapse. And I know anecdotally from speaking with folks who are in this space, for students who return to school, oftentimes that's within 30 to 45 days of returning to school after clinical intervention. What we also know is that there are oftentimes worse outcomes, so more severe kind of complexities for youth that have any sort of comorbid condition, And although the research literature is mixed across the type of mental health condition, it demonstrates that between 20 to 60% of youth experience some sort of comorbid mental health condition in addition to their substance use disorder. Furthermore, just under 50% of youth with a lot of substance use also have experience with the justice system. And sometimes this can be a great wake-up call for youth, especially youth and their families, if the parents get a call from the police and they realize, oh my word, we need to deal with the substance use because now we have the police getting involved. It can be a great opportunity to get them into the system, and yet it can also present a barrier down the road if, as a result of their substance use activities and interaction with the justice system, they have something on their criminal record that can get in the way of them accessing employment or things like that later on. So it's really kind of important just to keep in mind all those pieces and how they fit together when then thinking down the road about how to create an ARASC. Okay, and so now thinking about resources and supports, I'm going to be talking about recovery capital for adolescents. And really, I'm going to start by grounding this in, what is recovery capital kind of overall, because it was developed for adults and we've been doing work to really adapt this idea to adolescents. So recovery capital are the total amount of resources that one has to overcome substance dependency. And so it includes things like tangible and intangible resources and relationships and resources that can come from those relationships. It includes things like attitudes and beliefs and values and motivation, one's mental health status and personal characteristics. And what's really nice for thinking about an AROS through a recovery capital lens is that recovery capital thinks about and considers multiple ecological levels. So it thinks about the person and their own resources, as well as the resources of those closest to them within the larger system setting. And it also thinks about different types of resources across different life domains. And when I get into the different domains of recovery capital and some examples, that should really highlight how it does that nicely. Recovery capital does operate from this perspective of it's a process. Recovery is a process. Building recovery capital is a process, so it's going to change over time. With the idea being that once people start to generate some resources, they're very likely to be able to generate more. And so as people get engaged with the system, get engaged with the supports, build that recovery capital, you'll see shifts and changes and positive outcomes in various life domains that are kind of building on each other, almost like a snowball effect. And so what's really important to think about in terms of recovery capital and youth specifically is really emphasizing this idea of youth resilience. And so bringing them into this picture of and empowering them to feel resilient, as well as understanding kind of where they are developmentally and how they are unique. They're not just mini adults, but they have their own set of developmental aspects that need to be considered when thinking about building an AROSC and kind of building their recovery capital. And so one kind of framework that I wanted to bring in and just kind of briefly introduce is the idea of positive youth development, because oftentimes I don't know how much this gets integrated into the treatment and recovery space, but for adolescents especially, this concept of positive youth development can be a really helpful kind of framing. So positive youth development is framed as a process which prepares youth to meet the challenges of adolescence and adulthood through a coordinated, progressive series of activities and experiences which help them to become socially, morally, emotionally, physically, and cognitively competent. And so this definition really recognizes that adolescence is this large time of transition that comes with its own set of kind of barriers. And if you think about a youth in the process of recovery, they're trying to navigate their adolescence, trying to navigate their substance use. But it's important to remind them of their resilience and kind of the power that they can hold and kind of try to build that into their motivation for recovery. So bringing that into the recovery capital for adolescents model, this kind of broad overview just indicates the general resources that we like to think about, the general domains for recovery capital. And so it's based on the adult model, and so it keeps kind of those main domains of human capital, financial capital, social capital, and community capital. and really kind of just demonstrates how these all can fit together to support a youth and kind of build on each other. And so if we think about kind of at the very internal level, this idea of human recovery capital, and that's really just composed of those resources that someone holds. So what is their level of self-confidence and self-efficacy? What kind of motivation do they have, not only for their recovery, but for some larger goal, for some way that they see their lives moving? How healthy are they mentally, physically, cognitively? What sort of spiritual beliefs or faith might they hold? And is that important to them? It's not important to all youth or to all folks in recovery, but for some, it can be a strong support, a strong internal support for that recovery process that can help build recovery capital. And school grades are included in this kind of domain of human recovery capital because they can be a really helpful indicator of how healthy an adolescent is cognitively. And if an adolescent kind of chooses to go down that route of, graduating and going on to college and moving on in an academic space, those school grades can be that initial point where they may need some additional assistance in terms of tutoring and supports to build that area of recovery capital. But that can also kind of feed into their self-confidence as they're kind of getting back on track and into that system. And it can also be a demonstration of their likelihood kind of in the future to begin to build financial recovery capital. So if we move to financial recovery capital for adolescents, it's really important to begin to think about financial recovery capital and consider the adolescent situation. So obviously, if you think about the age range of adolescents, 10 to maybe 21, many of them are not able to drive. Many of them are not able to choose their living situation. And so it's really important when you're thinking about recovery capital to think about their level, their caregiver's level of income, education, employability, whether or not their caregiver has provided a stable living environment for them, whether or not they have health insurance that gives them access to evidence-based treatments. And again, this idea of transportation, if they're reliant on other folks to get places, to get to treatment or get to recovery supports or get to school, is that a source of stress for youth? And do they have that access so they can get to these necessary aspects of building financial recovery capital? And so I see a good question in the chat that I'll talk about briefly. So the question is, in terms of comorbidity, when youth have cognitive distortions, how do you get over that hump to start to build recovery capital? And I'm thinking you probably mean maybe human recovery capital. And I would say in that case, it's really starting at the beginning with youth and making sure that they're getting kind of the mental health support that they need. Because if there's an acute need, like cognitive distortion, or something that's getting in the way of them thinking about their substance use, you really kind of need to start at the basics and work with them there, and then kind of build from there. And so building recovery capital, you kind of start with the strengths, but jump in with supports as they're needed, or provide those kind of wraparound supports. And I'll get to that in a few minutes about, what's needed. So that's a great question. So moving on to social recovery capital, this is really kind of that interpersonal capital that a youth has available to them. And again, knowing that this developmental stage, that social influence is a strong predictor of how well they're going to do in their recovery journey. Whether or not they have sober and supportive friends is highly important to their building their social recovery capital. Do they have friends that understand where they are in their substance use and recovery journey? And do those friends kind of come alongside them and support them in that journey, but then also support them in doing fun things that don't involve substance use, right? Because your friends can be very supportive, but if you know that they're out, drinking on a Friday night and they didn't invite you because they want to respect your wishes, but you know that they're out doing something that you would normally be doing with them, that can be hurtful. And so it's not just having friends that are supportive of you, but having friends that really can come alongside your journey. And along these lines, although the family influence is somewhat mitigated because of the peer influence, it's still highly important for you to have a very supportive and structured family environment that prioritizes making their home a sober home environment. And it really, in the research that we've conducted with alternative peer groups, it's having family members that will come alongside a youth and take them to their alternative peer group meetings, be a part of their family group meetings, take that time and show youth that they're willing to kind of get involved and learn in the process alongside the youth and support them in that way. And so the other piece of social recovery capital is really the ability for youth to engage in other fun things outside of thinking about substance use, right? So certainly engaging in recovery supportive groups that are age appropriate for this population is going to be key to kind of build those sober recovering support networks. But teenagers also just want to have fun. And so providing opportunities for youth to do fun things that link up with their own interests. Are they interested in music and theater, in art, in doing things outside like hiking or, any of those sorts of things? Are those opportunities available to them that they can get engaged with and start to build up that social recovery capital? And I see a comment in the chat that social capital is also in the community, and that's totally 100% correct. And actually, oftentimes, as we're thinking about recovery capital and how to talk about it, that's a dynamic that we don't always know how to address, because to have good social capital for a youth involves having good community level supports where they can get that and build that social capital. And so those two are highly interchangeable. In terms of thinking about, if you don't have one, you're not going to have the other. And so that's where we move on to community recovery capital, and really the different ways that communities can demonstrate that they're committed to building community recovery capital for youth. And so is there availability of a recovery sponsor or recovery role model for youth in the community that is someone that come alongside youth who's been there and who can demonstrate a way to move through this process and to learn from it and to support them because they know what they're going through, and they want to support them in that way. And along those lines, is there the availability of alternative peer groups or young persons meetings? So ways that youth can get involved, begin to build that recovery community, that recovery sober network, and also just kind of connect with other people. And so we know some research has shown that oftentimes youth have a lot of access to substances through their school environment. And so things like having a recovery high school that's committed to sobriety and to abstinence for youth and committed to creating that space for them, or having access to a collegiate recovery community. These are all kind of like community level resources that can help generate that social recovery capital if they're there for the youth. And again, these can lead to youth feeling like a recovery identity is something valued and important, and it can reduce the stigma of experiencing a substance use disorder in the community. If you see that that's valued, then you'll hopefully feel less stigma around being a person in recovery. And so I've had a question about where this map is from. This is from the Association of Recovery High School website. Or it was the last time I accessed it. So I think they may have a more updated version actually, hopefully, but definitely check out that website if you're interested in identifying recovery high schools in your area. All right, so now before I move on to the next section, I did want to take a minute. I know people have been putting a few comments and questions in the chat, which is great. Please keep it up. Any other questions before I go to the next section? Okay. All right. So here's where we begin to start to dive into the real focus of this talk, right? Once the background is kind of in place, really providing a broad overview of a recovery-oriented system of care, with the perception in mind that this is from this idea of building recovery capital for adolescents, right? And so to do that, I think it's really helpful to just take a look at the terms that make up ROSC, right? Like what does recovery-oriented system of care mean if you look at each individual word, and why is this important? You'll see in a minute. So in terms of recovery, I'm going to pull that definition that I that I went through at the beginning, which is really that recovery is this process of change, right? It's something that's ongoing, it's dynamic, and it's this idea of really improving one's overall health and well-being, right? This holistic perspective of, what people need to feel successful and happy in life. Living a self-directed life, being in control of yourself and your kind of your situation and your life goal, and striving to reach your full potential. So all these pieces of recovery really suggest that, it's this kind of ongoing process that folks need to engage in. And so if you think about recovery and then like what it means to be recovery oriented from that perspective, some folks have argued that as a result, there should be no wrong door to enter treatment. Any way that someone chooses to begin the recovery process is a good way. And from a ROSC perspective, it's welcomed. And that's where the kind of thinking about, okay, how do we reorient the system to enable this as a possibility? That's really kind of transformational thinking if you sit down and think about it. No wrong door to enter treatment. The other piece of being recovery oriented is that there may not be any one right path to recovery, right? Everyone's journey is going to look very different. Their process is going to look different, okay? So that's really important kind of thinking about when we're talking about a ROSC, these are some kind of underlying values or perspectives that are important to hold. And along those lines, before we move into what a system of care is, it's really kind of foundational to think about this from a recovery management organizing philosophy. And so a recovery management organizing philosophy is really this perspective around kind of there's different phases of recovery, but folks can move in and out of these phases and they can return to earlier phases. And so the 4 phases are this idea of pre-recovery, recovery initiation and stabilization, recovery maintenance, full citizenship, but oftentimes, and especially for youth who are kind of working on their development, working on their recovery in and out of maybe different environments, some of these processes may need to be repeated. And that's okay, right? That's part of that no right path to recovery perspective. And so from a recovery management focus, it's really about thinking about how the client can help direct their management of their long-term recovery, given the values that they're holding and their own motivation. So it kind of, this perspective is trying to shift the focus of care from just being, these professional-centered episodes of acute symptom stabilization. Okay, you go into treatment, you deal with all the major stuff, and you send them back out. But really, how do you involve the client in this process? And so the thinking is really this idea of kind of making sure that the traditional treatment is wrapped within a more sustained continuum of both pre-recovery support services. So thinking about having services for folks before they're in that ready to recover phase, to begin to kind of enhance their, from a stages of change perspective, their readiness to change, right? And then as folks are moving through that process, ensuring that there are support services that can really enhance the strength of their recovery initiation and their ability to kind of keep on through that process. As well, from a recovery management perspective, it's remembering that folks exit treatment and they may still need a variety of recovery support services. And those are all things to support that person in that process and to help kind of build their recovery capital and continue building that recovery capital. Sorry. Okay. All right. So then kind of we've talked about recovery oriented and we've talked about what that would look like. And now let's talk a little bit about system of care. So system of care has kind of been broadly defined as this range of services and supports guided by an overarching philosophy. And this is a really important piece. It's supported by an infrastructure. So you can have a wonderful philosophy and you can have a variety of services and supports, but if it's not supported by an infrastructure that will allow all those things to work together and to work together in tandem, it's not a true system of care. It's going to be very fragmented and siloed. And so unfortunately, as I was kind of mentioning at the beginning, this is not a clean package. You can't cut and paste a system of care into every community and have it look all the same. It's not a one size fits all approach. It's going to be heavily driven by the stakeholders of that community. And so that's really important to remember as we're talking about what a ROS looks like, that it's going to have this kind of underlying philosophy and things that are guiding it. But it's up to individual communities to really implement it in a way that makes sense for them and for their stakeholders. That being said, Strauss and Blau, back in the 80s or 90s, developed kind of the initial system of care definition and have since then updated it. And they've really focused on it from the youth perspective, and what is a system of care for youth, children, and families. And so they define it as a spectrum of effective community-based services and supports for children and youth with or at risk for mental health or other challenges and their families, that is organized into a coordinated network with a supportive infrastructure that builds meaningful partnerships with families and youth. There's that piece about empowering folks, giving them control in the process, and also addresses their cultural and linguistic needs in order to help them function better at home, in school, in the community, and throughout life. And so really this system of care definition kind of gets at all the pieces that I think I've kind of been sprinkling throughout, but really, centers a system of care for children within their families and this larger supportive infrastructure with the ultimate goal of improving their functioning, right? And so a big piece of having a successful system of care is this idea of creating a wraparound, right? So a team-based planning process that can provide individualized and coordinated and family-driven care, right? All those pieces kind of wrap someone, if you think about like a burrito. I couldn't find a good burrito image, but that's kind of what I pictured when I was pulling these slides together, really to be able to meet all the complex needs of individual children who are involved in these systems and maybe at risk of placement in other institutional settings, right? And so in a ROS, this idea of wraparound, right, wrapping around the youth, is really important, and it drives why we talk about the need for integration. If you're going to be providing all these pieces, or if you're going to need to provide all these pieces, the best way to do that, the most resource sensitive way to do that, is to do it in an integrative way so that youth aren't shuffled from one place to another, but so that their needs and their families' needs are prioritized and they feel that integration within that overall system of care. Okay, so I have time for questions, and then I think we're going to do a break before I jump into putting the A into recovery-oriented system of care, which is adding the adolescent piece. So I do want to see if there's any questions. Yeah, and I see a question in the chat. It's a really good question. So in instances when an individual is completely not ready for recovery, how do you approach acute symptom management in the least traumatic way? Yeah, and I think I don't think there's a good kind of blanket answer for this question. It's a really good question about, what does it look like to work with a child and their family when lots of things are maybe going wrong but they're not ready to change. And I think it's trying to work with them to see, what might their goals and priorities be, like what do they feel is not working, and how can you start to build that motivation by addressing kind of that initial, okay, this is the problem and this is what you see as a problem, and let's kind of start that way. And that could be lots of different ways to do that in this system. It depends kind of on how it's identified, right? And who the family and the child trusts, and who they lean on for support, and maybe bringing those people in, or maybe they're the ones that link them to the service in the first place. And so that's why when we think about, there being not one path to recovery or not one door to treatment services, it really is about having this integrated system so that wherever they approach and begin the process, they can be led through to ultimately kind of end up on the outside with the right amount of support that they need. Yeah, so this is another really good question that I think it's, at the ability of our communities to provide that level of community recovery capital. So someone has asked, what about youth who are ready to change but don't have transportation or familial support system? And so this is really demonstrating, wow, they have some real gaps, right, in their financial recovery capital, in their social recovery capital. And so it's really, I think, oftentimes linking up with maybe folks that are in their lives that can be supportive of them. That it could also be involve linking them to other services, like social workers who can kind of help to link them up. I think it might involve thinking a little bit creatively, outside the box, maybe in terms of, okay, how are they going to get from A to B to be able to join this group? But it really should be a kind of a system level effort that can deal with that problem, because I think that's going to be a large enough population of youth in the system that there needs to be some sort of infrastructure to support youth that are going to come into this with that are ready to change, but they don't actually have the capital. And that's where the different elements of provider support and system infrastructure can kind of be built in to grow that recovery capital. And yeah, this is a great point. Someone else mentioned, certainly making use of online and telehealth systems. If youth can't get places, definitely taking advantage of those technologies that we've all kind of taken advantage of with the pandemic is one way to kind of think creatively about this as well. So I have a question about, are the recovery high schools accredited and managed through the local school board or managed through privatized organizations? It's a great question. I would say definitely check out the Association for Recovery High School website if you're curious about the structure. A short answer is it depends on the state. And so different states have different ways of setting up a recovery high school. There is an accreditation process for recovery high schools, and that is done by the Association for Recovery High Schools. But again, it really depends on kind of the initial organizing structure about how those schools are managed. And I think this came up one of the last times I was talking about this, but oftentimes, the schools can be quite expensive to run, but oftentimes schools will have provide scholarships and things for students who may not have the financial recovery capital resources to go there. So the idea with the school is not to be exclusive, but to be open and available to all youth. Okay, I'm just reading through another question here in the chat, which is a great one. So, okay. How do we shift focus off some of the misinformation on places like social media, especially in instances that sometimes encourage harmful ideas while still validating the child and their beliefs and ideas? Yeah, I think this is a really tricky one. I don't have a good answer, unfortunately, and I wish I did. I think it, in some degree, to some degree, it means making social media a safer place for youth, right? And I think we saw a lot of this with COVID and things like flagging misinformation about the COVID vaccine that I think could be kind of applied here. But certainly I think it's working with youth. A lot of youth actually tend to overestimate the amount of substance use and alcohol use in the community around them. They tend to overestimate those norms. And so to some degree, it can be important to kind of re-educate folks about that in a non-threatening way. So that's kind of one suggestion I would have for that one. Sorry, I'm just reading through some other comments here in the chat. Okay, so there's another really good question. We have a family who's able to identify the priorities to help their adolescent, but how does one locate the community-based supports? Yeah, and I think that's really tricky. I think, oftentimes that will really depend on the infrastructure that is set up and the level of capital that family has in the community. So who does that family know that can link them up with these things? A lot of folks are surprised when they hear about recovery high schools and think like, oh, my child could have definitely used something like that. And so really, I don't necessarily think it's on the school to spend more time and money advertising their services, but I think it's on the system to provide those linkages so that if a youth that could use one of those supports is identified within that broader system, they're linked up there, and that takes, you know, time to develop. But as we strive to create this system and do a great job of education and communication, that's where I think some of these barriers will be broken down, because we don't want obviously to leave families that are ready kind of, but just like totally clueless here. Okay, so I think Rebecca, now I think would be a good time to take a break, so I can save my voice just for a minute or a few minutes, and then we can come back, I think, in 5 minutes.
Okay, everyone, we will pick right back up at 11 o'clock. Okay, everyone, welcome back to today's webinar. Emily, if you are ready, I will go ahead and turn the presentation back over to you.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Thanks, everybody, for providing comments. I had another minute to kind of look through them. And there was a question earlier on about someone has a recovery community organization in Okeechobee. I hope I said that all right. And they service adults, but also have another agency across the street called Our Village, and they service the children. So I think the question is, how to advertise the fact that there's this other organization that's child serving and not necessarily adult servicing. And so I think I think that really depends on what kind of resources are available in the community to advertise those services, right? Or to share those services. And I think some of that will come down to also as a community working to reduce the stigma around seeking services and increasing the communication and linkages around what services are available. And so if folks are at the RCO and they're adult serving, but you know that they have children or they know of children that will be interested, like certainly sharing that information with them. So I think it's this question of kind of this larger, what the community and the community stakeholders are communicating about these services and how that information is getting out. And that really involves, sitting down with these organizations and having conversations around how to work on creating those linkages so that everyone knows about the services. And one final other comment that I saw in the chat before I move on to the next section. There is a Recovery High School founder and executive director that's on the call, and she's shared that there are 3 recovery high schools in Florida that are currently open. And they're always looking for information and volunteers, and there's an email that I'm hoping will be circulated later by FADAA perhaps, but thanks for sharing that about the Recovery High School. So now jumping into adolescent recovery oriented system of care. So putting the A into the ROSC. And so SAMHSA back in 2009 actually had a working group and came out with this report on really how to think about and how to develop an AROSC and what that would look like for a community. And so one of the things that they did was just create this kind of conceptual overview that I think is really helpful for thinking about an AROSC and why we would do it and what it would look like. And so the conceptualization is really that the key outcomes that you want to achieve by this AROSC are in the middle. They're at the core of why you're doing what you're doing, what you're seeking to achieve, and then immediately around that are going to be the values and the principles that are driving why those outcomes are important. And kind of stemming from that to support achieving those values and principles and ultimately those outcomes are those services and supports, are the individual system pieces that are supposed to all kind of fit together to develop this AROSC within this larger kind of infrastructure of funding and system linkages, administrative pieces that support all the services in achieving these outcomes ultimately for families and their youth. And so to start with thinking about developing an AROSC, the SAMHSA group kind of worked together and decided, with a group of key stakeholders, what they consider some of those key outcomes, right? Some of the things that should be at the core of developing an AROSC. And so they did this across 3 stakeholder groups, so youth and their family, and then kind of the larger system, what they're using to achieve, but all the stakeholders in that larger system. And so what they suggest for youth as outcomes are being very connected socially, right? So having strong and deep community connections to others around them. Increased capacity of youth to give back to the community, to act as agents of change or key contributors to whatever they consider their community. For youth to have increased self-sufficiency and self-efficacy around that self-sufficiency. And that they essentially, when thinking about them from those different developmental stages, that they should have increased the number of their developmentally appropriate assets. So our have they developed the skills that you would expect depending on the life stage that they're in? And so those are, the 4 key outcomes that this group identified as top for youth out of an AROSC. Now, for the family, they also had a few key outcomes, and one is this idea of family and sibling recovery. And so kind of recovery in the broader, more holistic sense of being able to act as a family unit, have good communication, good relationships, and really, see these outcomes together as a family unit. And for the adults, especially through an AROSC, to be able to be supportive of youth who are going through this recovery process. And so really it's the AROSC outcome for family is really this idea of having the family have developed a lot of social recovery capital that can then be fed back into the youth, but ultimately can benefit the family and kind of the overall community as a whole. Next, they talk about, the top AROSC systems, AROSC outcomes for the system at the system level. And really what this looks like in a successful AROSC is that there's support for the family and sibling recovery. So there are services, wraparound services that can act as support in the family and the siblings as they're learning about the recovery process for that person that they're supporting. And that there is going to be easy access to the system through these different entry points. So again, emphasizing this idea that there's, no wrong door to treatment. It's also for the family that they are able to access this as well. And so at the system level, it's creating this shift in what the system looks like and how people accesses it. And so, this is a SAMHSA group talking about, creating an adolescent recovery-oriented system of care. But notice what's missing, right? Notice what's not a top AROSC outcome. And we're talking about, substance use disorder recovery. They don't emphasize the substance use, right? They're emphasizing these other key aspects of overall health and well-being, overall functioning, overall ability to engage with the system. And so that's a really important kind of core value that I wanted to mention here. So in terms of kind of moving out from that core of the outcomes, SAMHSA also identified kind of the top 8 values and principles for an AROSC that kind of act as the reason for why these outcomes are important. And so the first 2 really center on the family and being family focused. So really emphasizing that the AROSC should support the entire family, however the youth kind of defines that family. And so they're very explicit in that it should be a broad definition of family. It should include, everything from the biological to adoptive, foster, parents, partners, grandparents, sibling, other kinship caregivers, friends, and others as defined by the youth. So those folks that the youth see as important, even if it's not their parents, even if it's not their close sibling, those folks need to be allowed to be active participants in an adolescent's recovery experience in an AROSC, right? So recognizing that every family is going to look different, but what are the sources of social recovery capital that can be built upon in this system? And that's going to look different for every youth. The next 3 values out of the top 8 are really focused on remembering that this is an adolescent recovery-oriented system of care. So making sure that the services and supports offered and the type of linkages offered are age appropriate and that they reflect that developmental stage of youth, right? And so I talked about at the beginning these kind of different, first of all, the different developmental stage that youth are in altogether, but then also throughout that, what that looks like. Remembering that it's really important to have a sense of where they should be, but then also a sense of where they are as a result of that substance use. And along the lines of, emphasizing positive youth development, another key principle is really this idea of promoting resilience, right? Promoting the knowledge that they can be strong in themselves and giving them some of that empowerment, feeling that they can be a part of this process and they can engage in a way that's different than if it's just this top-down, clinical approach where, you're going to be treated as part of the system and then you'll go out, and if you relapse and you're back in, and you're going to be in a different phase or whatever, but really emphasizing their role and the importance of being motivated to the extent that they can be, but kind of building that slowly as they move through the system. And so the final kind of 3 values are something we've also talked about in terms of thinking about this from a recovery management perspective. And that's really acknowledging that recovery is not going to be, for many people, it's not going to be linear. It's not going to be do A, then B, then C, and then D is you're gone and you're recovered. But oftentimes youth, especially, will need additional support, and they may return to substance use, and they may need a different kind of support. And so acknowledging that that's kind of built into the process. It may not be this acute treatment episode that does the trick, but kind of these ongoing supports that are important to their recovery journey. The other 2 primary principles are really this remembrance that recovery needs to be a strength-based process, and it's important to identify where youth have recovery capital and where they could have access to recovery capital if they were linked up with the kinds of community recovery capital supports that could support them building their recovery capital. And so these are kind of all the 3 main principles that the SAMHSA group came up with, really focusing on the importance of the family, the importance of recognizing the youth and where they are, and then the importance of identifying the strengths that a youth has and can build upon for the future. And I see there's a comment in the chat about an example of being strengths-based. Yeah, and it's a great question. And so I think oftentimes it's a reframing. It's not like, okay, what are you doing wrong and where are you taking risks and what behaviors do we need to change? But it's like, well, what sort of things are you looking to gain? What are some of your internal kind of motivations or things that you enjoy, even starting from that point? Looking for where there is some recovery capital, even if it's just a bit, and looking there to begin to build more recovery capital. So coming at it from building those strengths, and as you're doing that, hopefully working towards the barriers, towards addressing the barriers, but really focusing on the positives and kind of building that resilience and building the ability for the youth eventually to kind of take over in the recovery process. And so in addition to the top 8, the SAMHSA group identified a number of other, key principles that not everyone agreed on, which is why they're not kind of in the full list. But I think they're important to review because they're all pieces that can kind of help build a stronger AROSC if they're part of the overall picture. And so the first 3 here, empowering the youth or the consumer, youth and their families, being youth guided, being individualized, these are all aspects that kind of underlie this strengths-based approach, right? So working with the youth to see what their individual needs are and helping them see where their strengths are so that they can feel empowered throughout the process, which ultimately should help to promote their hope in the process. And that's going to involve, really emphasizing aspects that allow them to access different aspects of the treatment and recovery supports, giving them a choice. Hopefully there is a broad array of, services and supports that youth could have the potential to choose from. And so in an AROSC, the idea is really providing these different doors to being able to access the services to begin their recovery journey. A big aspect of making an AROSC work for its stakeholders is having culturally competent providers and having training around that so that youth who enter from a certain background feel as though they are welcome in these recovery support services. The other pieces, the next 8 or so, 9 or so, I could
Emily, I believe we lost you.
And really, ultimately,
Emily?
yeah,
Hey, I'm so sorry. You went out for a few seconds there. Will you go back just a little bit and so everybody can hear?
sure, yeah.
Thank
Okay,
you.
so, all right, maybe I went out after, I'm not sure. Working my way through this list here. Lots of values and principles. I overwhelmed the system. Sorry about that, everybody. Um, so, ultimately, the goal in this AROS process is to engage youth and their families. And so to do that, really, having culturally competent providers, engaging in a, non-discriminatory language and advertising communication about services, being collaborative across systems and with families so that they feel like they're a part of the process. Ultimately, what folks have proposed that, have really studied AROS for many years, or ROS for many years, is that if you're doing all these things, you're actually going to be more cost effective in the end. And some work actually in Florida has demonstrated that there are cost savings when a ROSC is kind of successfully implemented in the community. And so thinking about, those values, really the services and supports need to be driven from those values, right? Like according to the core, the conceptual figure, you have that core, and then you have the values and principles, and then the services are around that. So all the services and supports that are being offered should be driven from those values. And so we think about the first value, which is being family focused and having a broad definition of family. What does that actually look like in terms of services and supports? Well, so one would just be ensuring ongoing family involvement, and that could be through parent or family counseling, having family groups or family support groups, sibling support, not forgetting the siblings in this process or kind of other family members. And so making sure that not only are these activities and supports available, but that families know about them, right, and are encouraged and supported to engage in these services. Because if the family is unwell or is unhealthy, and they're not provided the services and supports that they need, they're not ultimately going to be able to support their youth as well in this process. So in terms of kind of thinking about some other services and supports, if we think back to the value of being age appropriate for adolescents, reflecting their developmental stages, promoting their resilience, from that positive youth development focus. Really, there's kind of two main types of services here that we would want to see. One would be making sure that there's a range of services and supports that can address kind of multiple life domains, right? Not just the substance use, but other things that can help youth build recovery capital, right? And so that looks like having linkages to life skills training or vocational training. What's there to do for fun and recreation that doesn't involve using substances? Are there opportunities for youth to develop some leadership skills and to be scaffolded into a system where they can see some ways to feel and be empowered in that process? And the other piece of this is really given the importance of social supports in recovery, but also for adolescents specifically, making sure that there are services that foster social connectedness as well. And so that may mean that having services like life skills training, being creative about how those are linked up so that, maybe they're done in a group so that youth can engage with other youth who are going through the same thing. Sorry, I'm coughing again. Wait. Sorry, everybody. The voice is starting to go here. So it's really, not creating more services, but using the services that are in the community to tap into the youth developmental needs. And that also can help maybe foster some social connectedness between youth. And the last kind of top 6 services and supports that were suggested by SAMHSA really fall into kind of thinking about this from the value of remembering the nonlinear nature of recovery and having this strength-based recovery capital foundation. And so, one of those top services and supports would really just be providing that linkage between continuing care and treatment services and other supports in the community. Remembering that recovery is oftentimes a long process for people and they need these wraparound services. Oftentimes youth are going to need some specialized recovery supports that will support their individual developmental needs as well as kind of their recovery specific needs. And so this can look like also having, specific therapeutic and clinical interventions that are built into the system. And so all these things are supposed to kind of work together so that a youth entering at any phase should have access to these different aspects of the system. And the providers that are part of that system should be able to link youth to these as well. And so it means having good communication and collaboration kind of across the system to support the introduction of all these different services so that there isn't waste in what's offered and that people are actually able to take advantage of the services that are offered. And this brings us to infrastructure. So I've mentioned this a couple times. What is infrastructure? These are the key elements that SAMHSA talked about. And really, it's the infrastructure is what's underlying all these services and supports that allow them to be in place and to function well in an integrated way so that every stakeholder in the system is aware of these different linkages and also knows how to kind of navigate the system. And this can be, very tricky, obviously, for families and youth. And I think this is where the ROSC can really break down, and we'll see that in the next section when I talk about kind of ways of thinking about a ROSC. If you don't have a certain kind of perspective in place about what the infrastructure needs to look like, then it will break down. And so one of the key elements of the infrastructure for a ROSC, for an AROSC, is really having family involvement at the design and the policy level. And so that's called really creating some supports for youth and family and professional partnerships for families and youth that are interested in this, and to bring them into some of this decision and policy. And so this is not individual provider can do, right? This is something that the larger kind of system has to do, that has to be done in collaboration with all kind of the key stakeholders, because you can't do these without them. Elements, another key one now is really just making sure that their policy enable this recovery oriented period, complementary provision of service. Some key things here are going to be the financing, how
Hey, Emily, the connection on our end is kind of going out. It's breaking up. Emily, we're unable to hear you clearly.
Okay. Rebecca, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay, I just then again, if you can't hear me, do I need to go back?
No, it came through pretty well.
Oh, okay. I did have a previous slide. All right, so I'll kind of talk a little bit about the bottom here, and then I'll go on to the next slide. And just let me know if you You can't hear me again. Yeah, and so really, making sure that these infrastructure elements can happen really will involve policy changes, right? So creating the policy that will allow a recovery-oriented paradigm shift to happen. So deciding as a group what that needs to look like, and then creating policies that will support that implementation. And so a lot of that will come down to kind of those larger systems in terms of, financing and what that looks like across these different systems, as well as how integrated different youth serving systems are, and whether or not there's the support and the underlying kind of pieces to enable integration, versus having, a bunch of wonderful services that are all siloed and don't talk at all to each other, and no one really knows about them. But so from an AROS perspective, it's really making sure that these infrastructure elements are in place to support system level change. And so a big piece of that is, once you have that infrastructure kind of in place or being developed, you need strong leadership. You need folks who are kind of willing to champion this and see it through. But you also need a pathway for developing leaders to take on that role, so that it doesn't die when the person who is championing it steps down or changes. And then ultimately, like initially, a lot of this, development and change is going to involve also developing the workforce and providing the kinds of trainings and supports, so that the workforce feels, the key stakeholders that are implementing an AROSC feel adequately supported and able to help with these linkages and help supporting youth and their families in this process. And so another key infrastructure piece is having many avenues for accountability, making sure that there is a variety of options for folks to check and make sure that the implementation of various aspects of the AROSC are being implemented as they're supposed to be, and that they are creating these linkages. You definitely are going to want a systematized way of measuring performance and monitoring that performance, and really having accountability for both traditional and non-traditional providers in the system, so that they're all kind of accountable to the AROSC system as a whole. And an individual, their experience in the system can be kind of tracked, so that you can see how the system is working as a whole and measure how different aspects of the system are supporting the child's recovery and the family's recovery as well. And so really, from the perspective of no wrong door to treatment, an AROSC should kind of think about and be a way for youth to enter the treatment and recovery support system from any of these larger, from any of these pieces of systems that are currently very fragmented and siloed. And so if we think about, for youth, what are some of kind of the key systems, that would be, the treatment system itself, the healthcare system itself, the community kind of level supports and systems, whatever's available in that community, the education system, which is a place where they're heavily involved, obviously day to day, typically, as well as for some youth, the justice system, that may be a door that they will enter into treatment. And so an AROSC would suggest that any of these doors to enter treatment are fine, and there should be linkages between all of these systems for youth to feel supported, and for ultimately for them to kind of move through the system in a way where there's not a lot of confusion about what they should be doing, or where they should go next for support, but the system is set up in a way that guides them and supports them in that process. And so, one of the pieces, obviously I'm, leaving things out, but these are just examples. So that means if a youth enters through, substance use disorder treatment specifically, or mental health specifically, or through their physical health appointment, through just going to a regular doctor, or, through family services, all of those pieces need to be integrated in a way that can support youth finding out how to get into treatment, how to get into recovery from a recovery management perspective. so that they're met where they're at, they receive the services they and their family need, and they can kind of move on to develop those life skills and continue kind of forward with linkages to the other systems as appropriate. And so similarly, if they enter through the community system, how might they enter? They could enter through, finding an alternative peer group. Hopefully, maybe they went to treatment and were linked to the alternative peer group directly from that treatment, but that's not always the case. And so it's just really thinking through these different opportunities. And then if they come out of treatment back into the community system, are they linked up to, are their families linked up to support groups that support the recovery management? Are youth linked up to activities that can build their social recovery capital, that can build their human recovery capital, to ultimately kind of support their overall development? Thinking about this from the education perspective, if they're identified with a need through the education system, do they have linkages to that treatment system? If they come out of the treatment system, do they have linkages to the type of education that's going to get them back on track, like tutoring and guidance counseling, or do they need a recovery high school to go back to versus kind of their old peer environment? Do they have access to kind of other supports within the system that will help build their social recovery capital, things that they like to do, like sports teams or arts, music, and drama? And how do all these pieces kind of work together to support them in their developmental trajectory? And thinking about recovery from this holistic perspective. And finally, if youth enter through the justice system, obviously that could be a place for them to go right into a juvenile drug treatment court where they're not immediately penalized, but they're kind of work through this phased system. But really, that could be a key point for bringing them into the treatment space, right? And if they come out of this system, where are the additional supports for their substance use disorder and for kind of engaging in additional job or skills training, getting back into education? So entering treatment through this justice system door should not be a barrier to them being able to continue on in their recovery and kind of in their life journey, although oftentimes it is, right? And that's a system level piece, that if there's better integration as people are exiting some aspects of the system, and they can be linked to positive developmental support, they can overcome, some of these barriers to developing more recovery capital. Okay, so I have time for questions. There's a question in the chat around an assessment tool. I did come across an assessment tool about, assessing the integration of a ROSC into the system. I don't have it here in the slides, but I can follow up with that after for the talk. I'll just make a note of that here. Okay, so moving on to the next brief section is really just, bringing this back to thinking about recovery capital. And so really what we would argue is in an AROSC that's working really well, that's part of this transformational system, the services essentially should be this linkage to developing all these different domains of recovery capital and positive youth development to kind of ultimately filter through and improve, those key outcomes that SAMHSA highlighted at the beginning. So that improves socio-emotional functioning, obviously like engaging in school and having success can help build financial recovery capital, improving the quality of life, creating some low-risk social networks within a larger kind of recovery supportive community environment. Ultimately, that's, what we would hope to see through an AROSC system. And so it's definitely been proposed, and I think the research, is tending to support this, although we don't have strong systems level research on this issue. But it's essentially, the idea is if we begin to think in this AROSC way and to really develop an AROSC with an integrated approach, what you'll see here is like the very bottom of this ice cream cone is the individual kind of building their recovery capital, and then you see them doing that with their family and their larger network within this, broader system of support. But ultimately, as they go through this process, ultimately what we'll see is the community well-being will improve. And so this is something that David Best and Johanna Ivers have referred to as the sprinkles on top of the ice cream cone. So really the idea that supporting an individual from a recovery capital perspective will ultimately kind of leak back up into the community. It'll create those sprinkles on top of the ice cream cone. And so you'll see these benefits kind of reach throughout the community as you're engaging in this work. And David Best and Johanna Ivers have also argued, although I'm not sure about the idea of combining ice cream cones with ink spots, but the idea is that there is a real contagion of AROSC thinking. And so if you begin to see that communities have integrated this approach, created this infrastructure, you begin to see these sprinkles in the communities, these positive outcomes trickle back to the community, that across communities, that actually is going to be very contagious. And that kind of thinking and structure will be shared in a way that will become very contagious. And you'll see these AROS kind of building throughout communities. And so that's kind of another argument for why thinking in this AROS way and collaborating with key stakeholders could be really beneficial kind of to the system as a whole, and not just that individual community, even though it may feel like a lot of work in the moment. And so before I move on to the last piece about kind of how to develop an AROS, I have a couple questions. So there's someone who's asked for a resource for adolescent recovery capital. So I have several articles around what adolescent recovery capital is, and how it kind of seems to present itself with adolescents from some research that I've done with others. If you're asking me about a scale, we're actually working to adapt some existing adult recovery capital scales now, and so that's something, unfortunately, that we don't have readily available, but that's something that I'm working on with some folks. And I know there's a group of researchers who are working on a scale for kind of older adults, older emerging adults, kind of the college age kids, to measure recovery capital. I have a comment that the slide might be blank, but I think just a question slide. So hopefully, Rebecca, you'll let me know there are blank slides. And then there's a question someone asked earlier about putting information in parents' hands. What do I think is the best format of getting information out to the parents? Flyers, schools, events? Yeah, I think I think any of those could work. I think some of that will be determined by talking to parents in the community and seeing how they would welcome that kind of information, right? I mean, I think nowadays there's a lot of information inundation, but certainly talking to folks and seeing what you think for your community will work the best. Paper flyers, could be great. Doing it at parent-centered events could be another opportunity. If it's a community that really values the church or a faith community, that could be another way to share that information and also kind of reduce some of the stigma around this for youth. And so that would involve engaging with key faith leaders in the community, right, and working with them to see what are some ways to begin to tackle the issue from that perspective. Okay, so one of the last sections is really this idea of how to develop an AROS, and I realize this this is kind of big picture things to be thinking about. This isn't going to be implementable by just one person. This is going to take a team and a system of people to work together, but just to kind of get you thinking about what are the pieces that it takes to develop an AROS in a way that's going to be sustainable. And so from a big picture perspective, it's not just adding a few recovery supports to the treatment system. It's not just saying, oh, we know the treatment isn't enough. We need to add some, some brief kind of recovery management checkups to our system. It's also not just having a network of providers who decide to collaborate to provide more coordinated care, right? Just kind of on their own, they say, oh, we're going to work together, we're going to be passing information back and forth. That is wonderful, but that's not necessarily what the AROSC is about. There's also some misconceptions that an AROSC is going to try to supplant what formal treatment is doing. And so an AROSC is not seeking to foster any sort of competition between these free, peer, and community-based services and formal treatment. What it's actually doing is recognizing that each of these have their place and they're important for different aspects and different elements of treatment, and they're both important and they need to be better integrated. It also does not necessarily require new resources, although it can be time consuming to develop. But as I mentioned earlier, it can actually in the long term kind of save money for systems if there is this AROSC integration that we're suggesting is important here. Sorry there. And so there's kind of, Dr. Akara has talked about 3 different approaches to developing a ROSC in general. And so there's this idea of an additive, a selective, and a transformational. And right now I'm going to tell you, we're arguing for a transformational approach to developing an AROSC. But what we see with the additive is that everybody says, oh no, there's a gap, in recovery support services. We have people and then they're not getting their recovery. Let's add some new services. But it's a fragmented approach because it's not actually making any sort of change to the larger system, and it's not working the treatment and recovery support services. So even though these things are recognized as important and they're being added, they're added in a way that it's just to the larger system, and it can actually create some confusion between providers and service users, and it can create a lot more work if you're just adding in services and not creating this kind of backbone to support it. There's also this idea of kind of a selective AROSC, which recognizes there's a gap, and then also recognizes, okay, we need to have some treatment practices that actually align with the principles of recovery, that think about substance use disorders from this perspective. And so in the selective ROSC, there is going to be this emphasis on developing some recovery-oriented programs or kind of different levels of care or phases. And then there will be this implementation of, treatment recovery integration. So maybe some off intervention, or, a small pilot of assertive linkage to care for youth, and kind of follow-ups or something after that. But there's not going to be any sort of larger system overhaul. And again, it's going to create, and for service users who aren't really sure, what door to enter to get into this system in a way that's going to support them fully. And so, as I mentioned, really what we're arguing here for is the idea of building a transformational AROSC. And so the entire nature of treatment needs to shift to this idea of recovery management approach so that there can be the correct linkages to all sorts of treatment and recovery supports. So it's this kind of larger systems level thinking that will support long-term, recovery from pre-recovery to recovery maintenance and wherever people kind of end up coming back into the system. And so along these lines, it's having peer and community-based supports that are integrated with formal treatment and community recovery context so that there's more of a seamless linkage between these different types of supports, and people feel supported and met where they're at and able to kind of take control of their recovery experience. And so another piece of creating a transformational AROSC is really ensuring that there's this diverse set of activities. And again, it's not just creating new activities, but perhaps it's linking to activities that are already there that we know are going to be important for positive youth development. And so some of this will involve, making sure that the languages used and the services available are appropriate for the cultural population that you're trying to reach. Developing more strategies for community education. and increasing prevention and early intervention. So I've seen some, questions in the chat about, how to have parents learn about programs for their youth and how to kind of increase these service linkages overall for families. And that's all a part of developing a transformational AROSC, and it involves sitting down with key stakeholders and having these conversations about what's already there, right? So doing some community mapping exercises, and then seeing how what's already there can be more integratively linked so that the treatment and recovery supports are seamless. And I do see someone in the chat has mentioned this idea of integrating this information into the school curriculum and clubs in the school. So definitely, having the schools be one of those doors to enter treatment if that's the only place that youth are hearing about the potential of treatment and recovery supports. But it's really thinking about how to meet people where they're at and talking to community members so that you have a sense of what they might think is a good idea, because that's really where you begin to build those collaboration and partnerships. And so, one of the kind of illustrations that I've heard about and just kind of wanted to pass on is really a transformational AROSC is about treating the soil and this idea of this healing forest approach, and that you don't just take someone out of their environment, fix them, and put them back in their environment where they weren't healthy. Because what's going to happen? They'll just kind of end up kind of possibly back where they were before. But it's really about healing the forest, healing the soil that they're in, so that when they're in that soil, they can thrive, right? And that's all about having healthy communities. And from a AROS perspective, it's really about focusing on youth and their development from this positive youth development approach. So some first steps to doing an AROSC is really to just develop a sense of urgency, which can lead to collaboration and buy-in. And so that's, developing urgency around the problem, and then how a community can work together to address that problem. Having this process that involves stakeholders and creating a collective vision, having folks come together so that there's conceptual clarity about that core. What are the outcomes that you're seeking to achieve? And then the values and principles that are around that. And so in terms of developing a shared vision, I think a lot of the pieces that I shared with you today about adolescent recovery, but then also how recovery capital fits into that process, are important to understanding what a shared vision could be around, and really focusing on principles that promote healing and wellness from this holistic perspective to help make an AROSC successful. Again, treating the soil and not just treating the tree within the soil. And so, the next piece is, once you've developed that vision and your stakeholders all have that conceptual clarity, then it's working together to align the practices and services, to map out what's already existing and how the system can support that integration and development. And so, one of the key questions that I want you to kind of think about, I don't have answers to these, but this will vary depending on your community, but really what does it mean for our services if we believe there are many pathways to recovery, or if we believe that there's no wrong door to enter treatment? How does that perspective and that conceptualization of recovery and treatment lead to changes in how we integrate our services and what's offered, and how we share those with folks? The next piece is really at the systems level, and this is obviously impossible to do as an individual provider, and this is why it's so important to create the sense of urgency and collaboration with all the stakeholders, because ultimately that infrastructure that I talked about is that the context really needs to be aligned to support these changes, because an AROSC really is going to have implications for those kind of larger levels that need to be able to support the actual integration of all these services. So obviously collaborations are going to be really important between these key community stakeholders, but it's also going to be bringing on board those folks who have power to make the decisions to create a supportive infrastructure. And the other piece that's really important for AROSC success is to engage folks who can be flexible and adaptable, because as folks that have been doing this work for a long time have relayed, this process definitely can feel like chaotic and messy. Like people and a lot of professionals and everybody in this process for that is going to be vital to ensuring a lesson. I've read Florida that it's for each community to kind of think about it from this perspective. So really, this is kind of a broad overview of this topic. There are still many areas that are left to address if you're developing an AROSC. What does it look like to involve youth in this process? What does it look like to empower them in a way where they feel and actually are empowered and they're not just involved as kind of like tokenistic figures because they can sense that? How do we deal with system level disparities in terms of access to resources and different levels of recovery capital or experience in the system? What are some ways that we can really fully develop cultural competence among all providers and kind of at the systems level? And how can we really, as communities, reduce stigma around families and youth that are experiencing substance use disorders? Those are areas that are left to address, not in the AROS literature, but in the recovery and addiction literature kind of as a whole that are going to be many years work, I think, but certainly valuable to engage in. And so I know I just have a few minutes left, so I'm looking for questions. I don't see any at the moment. So really, in summary, I hope what I've demonstrated through this talk is that really the idea of developing a recovery-oriented system of care and one that's focused on adolescents is going to require this new mindset and transformation of systems and services. So it's not up to individual providers to do this, but individual providers need to be willing to engage in this process, right, within this larger system. And so really, remembering that the idea is to engender hope, optimism, and the fulfillment of each young person's potential. Like that's that core of why this is important and why folks are engaging in this work. And so I hope you take that away with you today, at least, if nothing else, like that transformational AROSC, remembering why that's so important. And so I think I'm just going to click through my slides. There are some resources from the American Psychological Association, and I think there's another resource or two I mentioned I would look into after this talk. All the references are located here, but feel free to reach out if you are looking for other references that could be supporting this work. And I think there's just a few minutes left, but if there are questions, I'm happy to take them now.
Emily, I don't see any questions, but I do see a lot of high praise for you, and it was a great webinar.
Thanks, Rebecca. I want to thank everyone really for just contributing your questions and comments. That's what makes it a lot of fun for me to feel like we can engage and actually be useful in a way that can support your work. So thank you all for the wonderful work that you're doing. And thanks to FADAA for having me as well.
Well, and not seeing any more questions, and thank you, Emily, so much for this great presentation. And we've included Emily's contact information so that you may contact her with any further questions. And, once again, thank you so much, Emily. This has been absolutely fabulous and a great webinar. And just please note a couple of items of business, everyone, before we conclude today. Please see the chat panel for a link to today's webinar evaluation. You will need to take this to receive CE credits or statement of credit for this event. You will need to take the evaluation. I'm going to post it again in the chat for everyone as well. And remember, you will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation, and you can register with us as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE Broker for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, please provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license prefix and number when you register us for the first time, or make sure that your license number is correct in your FADAA profile. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You will need to use the same email address you used today when you registered for the webinar through WebEx when you set up your profile or when you sign into your profile, and that will connect your attendance and your profile together. You will also get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today, and the sender will be from messenger@webex.com. Please remember that the evaluation will close March 2nd at midnight. And we do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify everyone's attendance, we will upload the statement of credit as a journal entry within your profile. And thank you all again for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to thank the Florida Department of Children and Families, Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.